The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the abandoned highway. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed only by the thunderous roar of motorcycles as they cut through the silence. At the forefront of the pack was a black biker, his leather jacket adorned with patches that spoke of battles fought both on the road and in life. His presence was powerful, yet there was something about this ride that felt different. For miles, the road stretched out ahead like an unspoken challenge, but it wasn't just the pavement that lay before him. It was the unknown, the fear, the tension, and the dangers he couldn't fully control. Behind him, the roar of a much larger gang followed. A group of riders who, by reputation and experience, had a history of causing trouble. Known for their violent tendencies, they were a notorious crew, feared by almost everyone who crossed their path. But here was the twist. This gang wasn't just notorious for their actions. They were known for their deeply rooted hatred towards people of color. Racism was their foundation, their bloodline, and their legacy. And now they were on the same stretch of road as the lone black biker, a man who didn't back down, no matter the odds. This wasn't just a typical ride. It was a meeting of worlds that, on the surface, could never coexist. The biker knew the risks. He had encountered hate in many forms throughout his life. It was something he had learned to endure, to rise above. But there was a burning determination in his chest, a fire that refused to be dimmed by hate or fear. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let intimidation force him off the road. The world might be filled with people who would judge him by his skin color before ever hearing his story. But he had something they didn't: courage. As the gang closed the gap between them, a couple of their members revved their engines, signaling that they intended to overtake him. The biker's grip tightened on the handlebars, the vibrations of his bike a familiar hum beneath him. He knew this was about to get ugly. A few yards ahead, the gang's leader, a large burly figure with tattoos running down his neck and arms, shot him a look that could cut through steel. The black biker had seen that look before: condescension, hatred, the feeling of being less than human. But he didn't flinch. He wasn't going to back down. The wind howled through the air, louder than ever. It was as though the road itself was speaking, urging them all to make a choice. And for a moment, time seemed to slow as the two worlds, the bikers and the gangs, stood at the precipice of a confrontation. No words had been exchanged, but the tension between them was thick enough to choke on. It was clear that something was about to give. The biker had a choice: keep pushing forward or turn around and leave. He didn't come all this way to let fear decide his fate. In a moment of unexpected boldness, the leader of the gang gave a quick nod to his men. They closed in tighter, attempting to box him in. This wasn't just about challenging his ride. This was a test. They wanted to break him. They wanted to see if a black man had the guts to keep riding when faced with an entire gang of their kind. Their idea was simple: bully him until he proved his place. But that was where they were wrong. The biker slammed down on the throttle, sending his motorcycle surging forward. For a brief second, it was a race. A battle of willpower on the open road. But as they followed his every move, something unexpected happened. The gang started to slow, to hesitate. The leader's confident smirk began to fade, replaced by something he couldn't quite place. Was it respect? Was it doubt? Or perhaps something even more dangerous, a spark of curiosity? The black biker wasn't just challenging them with speed or skill. He was challenging their perceptions of everything they thought they knew. What did they truly see when they looked at him? Was he a threat? A target? Or was he something they had never considered before? Someone who had the courage to stand up, not just to them, but to a world that often made him feel invisible. But the most shocking part wasn't the biker's audacity to keep going. It was the change that began to stir in the hearts of the gang members. Slowly, the realization set in. Maybe they hadn't been as fearless as they thought. Maybe, just maybe, this black biker wasn't the one who needed to be put in his place. Maybe the gang had a lesson to learn about respect, courage, and what it truly means to be a man. The leader of the gang looked at his men, his expression now a mix of anger and confusion. His grip on the handlebars tightened, and in that moment, something shifted. Was this the beginning of a shift in power or the end of a long-standing belief that had kept them together? But before anything could come of it, the situation took another unexpected turn. Another member of the gang, a younger rider, pulled up alongside the biker, his face full of questions. He had seen something in the biker that no one else had ever seen before. Was it admiration? Was it fear? He wasn't sure, but he wasn't going to let it pass without confronting it. The gang's leader, seeing his men's hesitation, decided this was far from over. With one last rev of his engine, he made a decision. The biker had proven himself in ways they couldn't ignore. But the story wasn't finished. This wasn't the end of the road for anyone, least of all for the black biker, whose courage had left them questioning everything. What would happen next? Would the gang show respect, or would they let their hatred win? Would they continue down the same destructive path, or would this black biker's courage make them think twice? The answers were still to come, and the journey was far from over. The tension was thick, the stakes were higher than ever, and now everything was on the line. As the two bikes, one black and one white, roared down the highway, the sound of their engines echoed against the barren landscape. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the road ahead. The black biker, whose name was Marcus, felt the weight of the moment settling in. His hands gripped the handlebars, but his mind was elsewhere. It wasn't the speed or the challenge of the ride that occupied his thoughts. It was the gang behind him, the men whose hatred burned as hot as the engines beneath them. He had been in dangerous situations before, but something about this moment felt different. Marcus knew how this could end. He had seen it too many times. Men like the gang members, men who had spent their lives feeding off hate, could turn violent in the blink of an eye. He didn't want to fight, but deep down, he knew that this wasn't about him. This was about them. It was about how they saw the world, how they had been raised to see him. They saw a black man on a bike, and they felt the need to prove their superiority. To them, Marcus was a symbol of everything they despised. But Marcus wasn't just a symbol, he was a man. A man who had fought for respect, for freedom, for dignity. Behind him, the gang's leader, Greg, watched with a mixture of frustration and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Greg had never encountered someone like Marcus before. He had seen countless bikers, cowards, fighters, rebels, and outcasts, but none had the courage to stand firm the way Marcus did. He had spent his life leading with intimidation, controlling with fear. But Marcus, he didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He didn't beg for their approval. Greg's mind raced as he watched the lone biker ahead of him. A part of him wanted to break Marcus, to teach him a lesson, to show him who was in charge. But another part of Greg, the part he had buried deep inside, began to question everything he had ever known. His gang was built on hate, on dominance, on the idea that people like Marcus were lesser. But what if that wasn't true? What if Marcus wasn't what he had been taught to hate? The tension between them built with every passing second, and the gang members who had once rode proudly behind Greg began to grow uneasy. They could see the change in their leader, the uncertainty that was creeping into his thoughts. It wasn't just Marcus's defiance that was shaking their foundation. It was something deeper. For the first time, they were being forced to reckon with their own beliefs. The power they had always relied on was slipping through their fingers. As they approached a sharp turn in the road, Marcus knew this would be the moment. The gang would make their move, or they would back off. Either way, something would shift. The question was, what would it be? Just as he prepared to take the turn, one of the gang members, a younger rider named Jake, pulled up beside him. Jake's face was tense, but there was something else in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even respect. He revved his engine, and Marcus could feel the vibration of it under his feet. For a moment, the two men rode side by side, neither one saying a word. But in that silence, something shifted. Jake had grown up in the gang, had been raised with the same hatred that Greg and the others had instilled in him. But over the years, he had begun to question the teachings, the constant reinforcement of violence and division. He had seen the world outside of the gang, had seen people like Marcus stand tall and strong in the face of adversity, and he couldn't help but admire it. "Why are you doing this?" Jake's voice crackled over the noise of their engines, barely audible, but enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus didn't look at him, but he could feel Jake's presence beside him. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing," Marcus replied, his voice steady, calm. "I'm doing this because I've fought all my life to be seen as a man, not a stereotype. You don't have to agree with me, but you need to understand that I'm not going anywhere." Jake looked ahead, his mind spinning. He had always been taught that people like Marcus were the enemy, that they deserved nothing but disdain. But now, riding beside him, seeing the quiet strength in his resolve, Jake wasn't so sure anymore. Could everything he had been taught be a lie? Could the hate he had carried for so long just fade away? Before Jake could find an answer, Greg's voice crackled over the comms. "What the hell are you doing, Jake? Get back in line." His tone was sharp, demanding, filled with authority. But there was something about it, something that made Jake hesitate. He had heard that voice 1,000 times before, and it had always been enough to make him fall in line. But now the words didn't have the same weight. Jake felt a wave of defiance rise within him, a desire to break free from the chains of the past. For the first time, he didn't want to follow Greg's orders. He didn't want to be part of a gang built on hate and fear. He made a decision then, one that would change everything. Without another word, Jake pulled ahead, his bike surging forward. Marcus glanced over, surprised by the sudden movement, but he didn't question it. He didn't slow down. Whatever was happening behind him, whatever decision Jake had made, was not his to control. He had his own fight to face, and it wasn't over yet. The gang had broken formation. Greg's anger flared. "Get him," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. But something in his words faltered as he realized what was happening. Jake wasn't just defying him. He was questioning everything Greg had stood for. And if Jake could do that, what did it mean for the rest of the gang? Greg sped up, chasing after Marcus and Jake, but the uncertainty in his mind was clear. As they neared the next curve in the road, the stakes were higher than ever. The battle for respect, for identity, for change was about to reach its boiling point. Would Greg be able to hold on to his power, or would Marcus's courage ignite something within the gang that could never be put out? And what of Jake? Would his decision to defy his leader lead him down a path of redemption, or would the gang tear him apart for it? The climax was coming, and it was anyone's guess who would come out on top. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The tension on the road was thick. The sounds of revving engines and screeching tires were the only things breaking the silence as Marcus and Jake pushed forward, the horizon ahead getting closer with each passing second. Greg, with a furious glare in his eyes, accelerated, his motorcycle roaring like a beast, determined to claim what it believed was its due. But there was a hesitation in his heart now, a question that gnawed at him with every mile he gained on the two men ahead. Was he truly the leader, or was the weight of his hate and arrogance the real thing slowing him down? Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the noise of the engine in his ears, but his thoughts were clearer than they had been in years. His decision to break away had not come easily. He had known what was at stake, disobeying Greg, defying everything his gang had ever stood for. But the weight of Marcus's defiance, his courage, had made him see something he couldn't unsee. He wasn't just standing up to a gang. He was standing up to a lifetime of lies, of hate. He was standing up for what was right. Ahead of him, Marcus was focused, his eyes on the road, his movements steady. He had no illusions about what was happening behind him. He knew Greg was closing in, and he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The road was almost empty now, the open expanse stretching out like a challenge. Marcus wasn't just racing against time, he was racing against history, against everything that had come before him. And he wasn't going to lose. Not this time. But then, as Greg drew closer, something unexpected happened. The gang leader's bike veered sharply, almost as if by instinct, toward Marcus's. The moment was charged, the collision imminent. But just as the two bikes were about to clash, Greg hit the brakes, his tires screeching in protest. The gang behind him slowed too, unsure, caught between following orders and something else they couldn't quite define. Greg's eyes locked with Marcus's, and for the first time, the hatred in his gaze faltered. What was it? Regret? Fear? Something had shifted in the leader's heart. The tension that had been building for miles, the buildup of years of hatred, seemed to break in that instant. He didn't want to fight. Not anymore. The motorcycle's roar, which had once felt like a sign of dominance, now felt hollow, empty. The power he had always relied on had no hold on him anymore. Jake, still riding close behind, could see it clearly now. His gaze flickered between Greg and Marcus. The change wasn't just in Greg. It was in all of them. The gang's collective hate was starting to crumble. It was as if the walls they had built up over the years were starting to come down, piece by piece. This wasn't just about one biker challenging another. This was about all of them facing something deeper. They had all been part of a lie, a story told for too long. And now they were being forced to rewrite it. Greg slowed down completely, and for a long, tense moment, neither man moved. The sounds of the engines faded into the background, and all that remained was the quiet hum of the open road. Finally, Greg lifted his hand from the throttle, and in a voice so quiet that it almost seemed like it wasn't meant to be heard, he said, You've earned my respect." Marcus didn't immediately reply. The words, though simple, felt heavy. It wasn't just about the respect between two men on bikes. It was about breaking free from cycles of hate, of resentment that had been passed down like some twisted inheritance. It was about facing the truth of who they were and who they could choose to be. "You've got to do better than that, man," Marcus finally said, his voice calm, but laced with something deeper. "Respect isn't earned with words. It's earned with actions." Greg looked at him, and for the first time he nodded. He had spent his life judging people based on the color of their skin, based on the stories he had been told. He had never taken the time to see who they really were. Marcus had shown him that. Jake, too, had shown him that. The gang's loyalty had been built on fear, not respect. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. As Greg pulled over, signaling the others to do the same, the gang members stopped in formation. There was a moment of stillness, a collective pause, as if they were waiting for something. And in that silence, the truth of what had happened began to settle in. Jake was the first to step forward, his bike rolling slowly to a stop beside Marcus. Without a word, he extended his hand, offering something neither of them could have predicted: the start of a new path. It wasn't just about leaving the gang behind. It was about a choice, a decision to be better. To fight for respect, not just for themselves, but for the world they lived in. Marcus shook his hand, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There was no grand celebration, no trophies won. But there was something far more important. There was the promise of change, of understanding. Of a world where courage, not hate, led the way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final rays across the open road, Marcus, Jake, and Greg stood there together, a moment of unity between them. There were no words needed. They had all come to a simple truth. Respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned by the way you treated others, by the way you chose to live your life. And though they had taken different paths to get here, they had all arrived at the same place. The road ahead was long, and the journey was far from over. But for the first time, they knew they wouldn't be walking it alone. They had each other's backs now, and that was a kind of victory no one could ever take away. In the distance, the faint sound of motorcycles revved to life once more, but this time it wasn't an echo of hate. It was the sound of change, of a new beginning. The ride was just beginning, and they were ready to face whatever came next, together.